Dr. Brechin, I want to talk to you about San Francisco's highs and lows. Let's start with the highs. When would you say was or is San Francisco's golden age?
Well, I would say it was the Silver Age, actually, because people paid too much attention to the gold rush. And it was running out, it looked like it was running out by 1855. So there's a crash. In 1859, news comes across from the other side of the Sierra that silver has been discovered in what becomes known as the Comstock Lode under Virginia City. And an enormous amount of gold, but particularly silver, came out of that. That's why Nevada is called the Silver State. But that silver and gold flowed down to San Francisco and largely built the city in the late 19th century. In order to exploit it, because it was a very difficult deposit to exploit, the San Francisco Mining Exchange was set up in 1862. And it becomes, some people have called it the first modern mining exchange because it persuaded small investors to put their money into the stock market in the hopes of making a big win. Very few of them did. But what it really did was to fertilize the soil and draw more people to San Francisco. So that's the silver period.
Okay.
There are several depressions that followed that because the silver began running out in 1878. The Spanish-American and Philippine-American War in 1898 and the acquisition of Hawaii in 1898 was very good for San Francisco.
In what sense?
Well, because the military comes to the Bay. It had already been there. The military has always been important to the Bay Area. And it really stimulated business. And then the business leaders began to talk about San Francisco surpassing New York and becoming the new Rome of the Pacific, because they imagined that the entire Pacific, not just California and the West, would be tributary to San Francisco, especially once they got Hawaii and can start exploiting that for sugar and pineapples.
Wow, well, that is fascinating. So we're talking about 1898, or like 1900, right?
That is really important for San Francisco.
And they're thinking that San Francisco is going to be the new Rome of the Pacific.
Oh, yes.
Wow, talk about ambitions and aspirations. Okay.
You find belligerent monuments, bronze monuments in San Francisco celebrating the conquest of the Philippines and various other things as well, too.
So that must be a high point of the city, right?
Well, it's a high point for the city's economy.
Yeah.
And then you have the earthquake and fire of 1906, in which about half of San Francisco, and that being the most important part, is simply wiped out in 3 days. And so that holds San Francisco back. In 1912, in anticipation of the great 1915 World's Fair, which was another high point, San Francisco looks to New York and tries to adopt a similar borough system by incorporating Oakland, Berkeley, and possibly more into greater San Francisco. That's put to a state vote, and it's voted down in 1912 because of the opposition of Berkeley and Oakland. And that was the great missed opportunity, because had that passed...
For San Francisco or for Oakland and Berkeley?
That was the missed opportunity for San Francisco and the Bay Area. Because if that had passed, San Francisco would have a coordinated planning and transportation system like New York City does.
Yeah.
And it doesn't.
It doesn't. No. Yeah.
No, not at all. The World's Fair in 1915 was a very high point, but really important was the mayoralty of James Rolfe, Sonny Jim Rolfe. Every great city, I think, has a great mayor, and Rolfe was it. He was mayor from 1912 to 1932 when he became governor of California. Rolfe was an inspirational character, great orator. People loved him. He brought the city together. And so much of what's wonderful about San Francisco was built under Mayor Rolfe's mayoralty. Of course, it's just before the Great Depression as well, too. And then you had this great architect, Timothy Pfluger, who I think was a real civic imaginary, who has been largely forgotten, but left us some of our finest buildings of the time.
If I may just interrupt you for a moment, please, Dr.
Sure.
Brechin. I know about James Rolfe. What I'm wondering is, why is it that we don't have any big boulevards, streets named after him in San Francisco? Correct me if I'm wrong. I just don't recall. Right? Do we?
You're absolutely right.
And I wonder why.
Yeah.
Like, if you go to San Francisco, and go ahead, please.
Well, San Francisco forgets its history. I mean, it's very selective in its memory. And so there should be a monument. Well, no, I'm wrong. The San Francisco City Hall, which is absolutely magnificent.
It really is.
In comparison with its models in France, is the James Rolfe City Hall. That's its formal name.
Oh, I did not know that.
Yes.
For our audience, when Mayor Brown was sort of retrofitting the San Francisco City Hall, what did they call it? Taj Willie?
That's right. Yes, I forgot that.
That was, what, 1990s. My cousin actually got married in the City Hall. Just beautiful, magnificent. So, okay, that's the reference. So that's the reference to Rolfe. Okay, I get it. Yes. So that would mean...
You know, Adele, I'm also the other person who has been largely forgotten is the architect Timothy Pfluger, who, as I said, was an urban visionary.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to get a memorial to Timothy Pfluger now, because most San Franciscans have never heard of him.
I had not heard of him either until today, as I'm speaking with you. Going forward in San Francisco's history, what is another high point? Is it after World War II, where all the military installations are there? Is it, I don't know, when Silicon Valley comes to town just south of the city? When is it? Do we have other high points?
Well, I think World War II was very good for the city's economy, as was the Spanish-American War. And then the founding of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945 momentarily made San Franciscans believe that it was going to be the UN headquarters, that it would be a kind of Geneva of the Pacific. That didn't happen because the Rockefellers pulled the UN back to Manhattan, where they wanted it to be. But there was great prosperity in the post-war period, which many people look back to with great nostalgia. The late 70s was a very dark period because you have the arrival of AIDS, which devastated so much of the city's population, and the assassination of Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Milk. That was a really dark period in San Francisco's history.
Yeah.
Then in the 80s, major businesses begin to pull out. The headquarters begin to pull out or be swallowed up by large companies. You have up until that time, you'd had family-run department stores, and the owners of those department stores were civic leaders. They disappear. The law firms start disappearing. The big banks like Bank of America and Wells Fargo, they move out, although Wells Fargo's only recently moved out. And that's not looking good until Silicon Valley comes to town and actually consumes and subsumes San Francisco. And that looked really good for a while because San Francisco was a center of innovation.
Yeah.
Until it wasn't anymore. And that's happened in the last few years, especially with the arrival of COVID.
I laughed when you said that looked good for a while because I think I know where you're going. I'm just going to go to it. Are we in the lowest of the low right now for the San Francisco Bay Area? Wow.
Yes, we are.
You didn't even stutter.
No, I can't think of any period in the city's history when it has been this low. But I want to say that, San Francisco is a favored punching bag for the far right because of its liberal politics.
Yeah.
But its problems are, to a large extent, a microcosm of those of the United States. I want to stress that. Much of what's happened.
How so?
Well, one thing that the technology in Silicon Valley did for San Francisco was jack up the price of real estate to astronomical levels. Because the people who had made these gigantic fortunes in technology in Silicon Valley, they didn't want to live there. It's the big snooze. They wanted all that a big city had to offer, and the nearest one was San Francisco. So they moved up, bought up a great deal of the real estate, making it impossible for the middle class to live there and pushing down the poor often onto the streets, which is, such a big problem now. Much of this has to do with, the enormous wealth that flooded San Francisco, which looked good to some. To me, it looked terrible. It was obscene because you had obscene levels of wealth and consumption, and equally obscene, perhaps even greater obscene, poverty. And that's what's causing so much trouble in San Francisco now, is the drug addiction and the poverty that's so visible on the street. Now, the wealthy thought that they could escape it by living in safe neighborhoods like Pacific Heights or areas south of Market. But the recent stabbing of the tech mogul Bob Lee south of Market, and then the break-in and bludgeoning of Nancy Pelosi's husband in the heart of Pacific Heights has shown that that's not true. And so the wealthy are finding that, in fact, this disparity of wealth, for which they are so largely responsible, they can't escape it themselves, because there's this breakdown of civic order. And again, I want to stress that this is happening all over the country. It's just that San Francisco is a punching bag and people are looking to it, but this is happening in all other cities around the country. Along with poverty.
Let's parse this apart a little bit.
Sure.
First of all, when I asked you whether or not this is the lowest of the low for San Francisco, you categorically stated yes. So let's define what low means. And I think you already hit 2 points. Homelessness, which goes hand in hand with poverty. Anything else? What is the definition of low?
Well, a city thrives on viable businesses, hotels that can be filled for the tourist trade, for example, large law firms, banks, and then retail, the department stores, etc. They're all pulling out.
So lack of viable employers.
Yes.
And property class that would have an interest in further gentrifying. Well, gentrifying, that's a wrong thing to talk about. But keeping the city up, right?
Yes. And a third of the offices in the financial district today are vacant.
A third?
A third. You walk down Montgomery Street, the so-called Wall Street of the West, and you look up into these buildings in midday and you don't see many lights on them. Well, they're vacant. A lot of them are just vacant. But then what you see, a downtown is an ecosystem, and those office workers supported the people, the shops, the restaurants.
Yeah.
Many of those are closing. So what you see is boarded up storefronts and offices or restaurants or so. They're pulling out. Now, in the last year or so, the big department stores have started pulling out. The stores around Union Square.
Like Nordstrom.
Nordstrom, a number of the stores. I mean, I don't know how much longer Macy's can hold on.
Oh, come on. Macy's is like a landmark over there. I mean, if Macy's leaves Union Square with the restaurant on top, I forget what the restaurant is, Cheesecake Factory on top of the view and the balcony, that's just
that's Neiman Marcus. I think they've gone already.
Okay, they've gone already. Oh boy,
I may be wrong about that. But
you identified homelessness / poverty, and then the exodus of viable businesses, large and small. You didn't yet identify crime as one of the definitions of low.
No, it's all linked together. The statistics show that violent crime is actually dropping, but that's not the perception of people. In San Francisco and elsewhere outside of the city, the perception is that civic order is breaking down, largely because of the visibility of homelessness, mental illness, and drug addiction, people defecating on the streets,
Oh
etc.,
boy.
disorder on the public transit. And that's the public perception. And that's hastening the evacuation of both businesses and people from the city, because cities rely upon civility to be viable. That means people must feel secure, they must feel safe. And if they don't, then businesses and people leave those cities. And that's what's happening to San Francisco. It's happening to other cities as well, too. It's just that it's most pronounced in San Francisco now.
We're going on a tangent here, but I have to ask this question. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, lived in San Francisco, and I've been to many other cities. Why is homelessness so connected with San Francisco? I've spent so much time in New York City, particularly Manhattan, Los Angeles, Boston, but homelessness in San Francisco has always sort of been etched in my mind, stuck with me. UN Plaza used to be called, when I was a younger man living in San Francisco, Urine Plaza. Even this is back in the 90s, not even now. So why is homelessness so connected with San Francisco?
Well, because again, San Francisco is a punching bag, because all other cities are having huge homeless crises now too. Los Angeles has the largest homeless population in the United States.
Which is funny, everywhere. You don't hear as much about LA as you do about San Francisco.
Well, you just go downtown to LA, which most people don't do, let alone towards the river, and you're going to see thousands of homeless tents, and then it's all over. I've seen it in the Arroyo Seco. I mean, anywhere where there's vacant land, you're going to see homeless. In San Francisco, it's just visible because San Francisco is a much more dense city, but it has to do with the price of land that, and the cost of rents that so few people can afford in San Francisco. So it pushes people out onto the streets. I would say, however, that the original sin was the closing of the state mental institutions it's 1967 to 72, when Governor Reagan began closing the state mental institutions. And then you have the Supreme Court outlawing vagrancy laws in 1972. And so we're seeing the result of that now. But because we have so much untreated mental illness. And if you're not crazy when you move out onto the streets, you're going to be crazy pretty soon.
Yeah.
It will make you crazy. And so you have all these problems, but I think, again, it has so much to do with the disparity of wealth between the very wealthy who are hoovering the available money up and leaving so many people impoverished. And where do they go? They go onto the streets, and they go to drugs.
I noticed you said, disparity of wealth, and you hoisted much of the blame on the wealthy, but I didn't hear you say anything about San Francisco's city government, the mayors and, council members and what have you. The job of the wealthy is to make money. When I had a startup, my job was to make money and make investors rich. I mean, that was my dream.
Yes.
Their job is not to take care of the poor. I mean, if they do, that's a great thing. And they should, by the way. I'm not saying they should abdicate that responsibility once they've made money, but why not talk about the mayor and the city council and all of that? You think they're to blame too?
Well, I think that they share a good deal of the blame too. I mean, and although I'm not sure it's so much their fault. I mean, I just don't see civic leadership today. Even with Mayor Breed, I don't see a charismatic figure like Mayor Rolfe, or nationally like Franklin Roosevelt. These people don't really exist anymore. And you've got a very liberal board of supervisors, and they're facing a crisis of this very visible homelessness and disorder on the street, which is driving people and businesses out. They're trying to do the right thing by providing social services, but that only seems to attract more homeless to San Francisco, because other cities like Phoenix, for example, Las Vegas or others, they're not providing social services. So they're pushing the homeless out, and they will come to a place with a more equitable climate and which provides at least some homeless services. It's costing the city an enormous amount of money.
Yeah, I remember it was in the late 80s or 90s that San Francisco sued Seattle because Seattle was buying bus tickets for its homeless to come to San Francisco. So it sort of resonates with what you're saying. You mentioned FDR, and I want to read something that you emailed me before this podcast conversation. You lamented to me about, quote, civic imagination embodied in architect Timothy Floger and the founding of the UN, which is now largely forgotten. The horror of UN Plaza is a stark refutation of everything that the Roosevelts hoped that the organization might achieve. That civic imagination seems to have moved south to where you are. You mean me living in Southern California. And then you added in your note to me, Dr. Brechin, I'd like to discuss this with you. So let's discuss it. What did you mean by this email that you sent, the Roosevelts and the civic imagination?
Well, the United Nations Plaza is named for the creation of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945. Another event that was at the time called by some the most important meeting in world history. It has now been almost entirely forgotten in San Francisco, except for UN Plaza. UN Plaza is a so-called public space about 2 blocks away from San Francisco City Hall, facing on Market Street, the main thoroughfare of the city. In the 1960s, a great landscape architect named Larry Halprin designed that as a memorial to the United Nations. It's filled with monuments and inscriptions, which are incredibly idealistic about where we might go if we honored Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal for everyone, for everybody in the world. In particular, Roosevelt said in 1941 in his State of the Union address that in addition to the 2 freedoms in the First Amendment, freedom of religion and freedom of speech, should now be added freedom from fear and freedom from want. And freedom from fear was based foundationally on freedom from want. We had to wipe out poverty because so many of the other pathologies that we're not dealing with now or making worse are rooted in poverty. We've forgotten that. So what's happened is that the poor concentrate in United Nations Plaza. You see open air drug dealing, shooting, defecating, just incredible disorder. And it's an extraordinary rebuke of the idealism of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt and of the United Nations at that time that it's come to this.
Yeah.
You know, it's a refutation of the future we might have had, but have forgotten that we took the wrong turn. And so are now living in this dystopia, which is so evident on the streets of San Francisco and so many other American cities, and in the mass shootings that we have now come to take for granted as part of American life. Well, I mean, public libraries have become victims of this change in American society, and you can see it in San Francisco's main library, which was designed as a kind of palace in the 1960s, but they've become de facto homeless shelters with all the problems. You know, they need...
You mean they sleep inside the library?
Yes. They wait at the door for it to open because it's a warm or air-conditioned space. So they become homeless shelters, and they are filled with mental illness and drug addiction and all kinds of problems that go with that. So that means that that public space is no longer a public space because it discourages people from going and using the public library.
That's a shame. We'll be back after a short break to talk about Imperial San Francisco.